Greetings, cast of thousands, and welcome back to Fair Game. It actually took me a bit of finagling to get this recording working compared to the last one, since I actually had to go through 2 re-records in order to get this match to record properly. ZSNES was just not cooperating, and I apologize for that. That said, no more dicking around, it's time to start playing some soccer. Today's opponent is Pharaoh. Pharaoh is actually responsible for one of my favorite long-running memes in the Megaman franchise. Like many of the funniest memes of its time, it actually dates back to the Megaman Ruby Spears cartoon. In it, there was kind of an interesting thing that happened in many episodes, where if Megaman stole a weapon from a robot master, they'd usually panic or act like an idiot while Megaman proceeded to kick their ass. Then in one episode, Megaman stole Pharaoh's weapon, and Pharaoh responded by punching him in the face. That reminds me, actually, if you're ever roaming the internet sometime and you come across a couple of memes from the Megaman Ruby Spears cartoon, there is probably a 60% probability that I am responsible for it. I apologize. Anyway, as for our opponent, Pharaoh, he's one of the rare defensive characters in the game, which means that he's a lot slower than Megaman, but he's harder to steal from, kicks way harder, and has a much stronger tackle. He's also unusual in that he's one of the taller characters too, which means he's actually better at headbutting the ball than many other characters are. In a lot of ways, I consider Pharaoh to be kind of the man-maker of the early game. If you're not familiar with how Megaman Soccer plays, he may actually be one of the hardest opponents, just because he's so good at stealing the ball and so hard to get the ball away from despite his slow speed. On top of this, he's got a beast of a super shot in the Pharaoh shot, which will light anything it hits on fire. I don't know exactly what shots he may be strong or weak against, with the exception of 2. I know he's vulnerable to Flashman's shot, and he's vulnerable to Skullman's shot. You're actually going to be seeing a lot of our Skullman in this particular fight, mostly because he's one of the better offensive characters that I have at this point in the game. So, since he's okay stat-wise, and he's got a shot that Pharaoh happens to be weak against, yeah, he's going to be in the front a lot, and you're going to be seeing him fairly often for this match. Pharaoh's stage is a bit unusual because it takes place entirely on a sandy field. An interesting thing I noticed is that unlike Nintendo World Cup, where the different fields greatly affect ball physics, really doesn't in this game, which is kinda odd. Chronologically, this game is canon, and it does take place between Mega Man 4 and Mega Man 5. That actually does sort of make me wonder where most of these matches are taking place in. I know that this one, more likely than not, takes place in or around the temple that Pharaoh was designed to protect. Since before he was redesigned as a combat robot, he was mostly sort of a tourism robot that was designed to basically protect this one temple from defilers. I know Mega Man's field in this game takes place in or around the stadium where the game originally started, and I also know Wily's stage obviously takes place at Skull Castle. I think Elecman's stage takes place in there as well, because it's got the same, Wily motif for everything, but other than that, sky's the limit, you decide. Interestingly, while every stage has its own unique music, I wouldn't say really any of them are all that great, except for maybe Wily's stage and a couple of other ones. It is rather interesting that despite the fact that he is significantly slower than Skullman, Pharaoh is actually a much harder opponent to score on because the goalie is so much tougher. The defense stat in Mega Man Soccer actually has a few different purposes depending on individual positions. First, and most relevant, it determines how easy your character is to steal from. This seems to work kinda like super armor in your average fighting game. Basically, the higher your defense stat is, the more likely you are to be able to just ignore someone tackling you. Usually this is tied to how heavy the unit is, especially in the case of Pharaoh, Woodman, Dustman, and so on. Near as I can tell, every time you tackle or slide, it runs a calculation of the tackling stat against the defense stat. This is actually part of why Pharaoh is as tough as he is in the campaign mode. See, a lot of newcomers to the game often just go for the fact that the faster players are just better. And they're not wrong for thinking this, because it is actually really easy to play the game a certain way if you're using faster characters. However, once you know what you're doing, the slower characters become more and more desirable for their own reasons. Except Woodman, because he's too slow. Woodman does make an okay goalie though, so there is that. This is because the defense stat also determines how good in general the character is at goalkeeping, aside from their resistance to super shots, which is of course determined independently. You know what I just realized? I think with the exception of Anchor, every single robot master in Mega Man Soccer has appeared in the Mega Man Ruby Spears cartoon. Okay, technically Skullman hasn't either. There's like animatics and concept sketches for him, but he never appeared in an episode. That is kind of interesting though. If you want to get really, really needlessly technical, than Mega Man Soccer predicted parts of the Ruby Spears cartoon. Or as I used to jokingly call it, Ian James Corlett and Scott McNeil arguing with themselves every episode. No joke or exaggeration, the two of them voiced basically every character on that show, with the exception of Roll. You know, looking back on it and other works that those two have both been in, I'm like 90% certain that both of them kind of enjoyed doing stuff like that. In basically every single Dawn of War game, there are scenes where multiple characters by Scott McNeil are interacting with other characters by Scott McNeil. Probably the goddamn funniest of all of them is the intro for the Chaos Stronghold and Soulstorm, where Scott McNeil voices literally every character in it. The Chaos Marines, the Cultists, the Chaos Lord himself. It's hilarious. I've actually grown to kind of love Scott McNeil because of it. Along with Corlett and, of course, Cam Clark, they make up the holy trinity of voice acting. Of course, you also have ones who are just legends in their field, like Maurice LaMarche, who are just everywhere if you go looking for them. Why that's so interesting is that basically every single work involving Mega Man that has come stateside and has had a budget higher than pencil shavings and wood glue has had these guys in it. It's kind of amazing. I don't know, I'd say Ian James Corlett does a pretty damn good job as Mega Man, and Scott McNeil as Proto Man is pretty goddamn good. I will say, however, that Scott McNeil as Dr. Wily is goddamn amazing. Like, no joke. Listen to McNeil's Wily sometime. He sells it. It's great. Actually, speaking of Scott McNeil's Dr. Wily, I always thought it was really amazing how they actually managed to characterize Wily in the Mega Man cartoon. Like, they could have gone the route of every other kid's show back in the day and just portrayed him as some generic evil bastard who doesn't really have a reason for doing what he does beyond doing it. That's not what they did, though. They gave Wily a kind of interesting backstory. He was actually a friend of Light's at one point, and they do get into what led him to A, become a scientist in the first place, and B, why he turned on Light so viciously when he did. It's actually in the pilot episode, which, no joke, is one of the best pilots I've ever seen for a cartoon of its type, that gets into it, but basically Wily grew up in soul-crushing poverty and didn't really have any money for anything. So when he finally did have the ability to kind of flex his creative muscle and show off what he could do as an engineer, he took to that. The problem is, when the two of them were first developing in the initial batch of robots that would eventually lead to Mega Man and all the others, there were problems with some of the prototypes' mental development systems, which basically caused them to go berserk and not listen to orders. Light believed it was the control system at the time. He wasn't wrong. But that was a subsystem that Wily himself developed and frankly pumped his heart and soul into. Light wanted to scrap the whole control system and start all over with it, and Wily was having none of that. What's actually really interesting about this take on it is the way that it's actually done. Wily had obviously already had a chip on his shoulder the size of New York State, so even though he's relatable in the first episode, it also comes across that he's a braggadocious asshole with delusions of self-importance. So the transition from him being simply an engineer and Dr. Light's partner to being this grandiose tyrant bent on world domination and his own self-enrichment actually kind of makes perfect sense given the show's context. What's actually kind of interesting is that the show kind of gets across why it is that Wily hasn't really been stopped. It's that despite the threat he obviously poses, no one outside the areas that he is currently threatening takes him remotely seriously. Like, there is a credible argument to be made that the entirety of Dr. Wily's character in the Mega Man cartoon is focused on dealing with his own self-destructive issues and programming robots that may or may not listen to him at any given point in time. Like Light's robots, Wily's are entirely capable of self-determination and making their own decisions. Even though Wily has used allegiance subroutines and various hardware and software to ensure compliance by his robots, they still continually disobey. It's actually a really clever reference to the first episode, how it was the control system, which Wily himself developed, that caused Proto Man to go berserk, and, correspondingly, what causes his current batches of robots to go berserk, because they have the same flawed control system, so his control over them is rather tenuous. By midway through Season 1, it's heavily implied that Wily keeps most of them in line through fear. You have ones that are obviously happy to be in his employ, like Cutman and Gutsman, and then you have Proto Man, who just goes off and does whatever the hell he damn well feels like. It's actually kind of funny. There's a lot of great ideas and a lot of squandered opportunities in the Mega Man cartoon. They actually had really big plans for the third season, including making the show a lot more serial, which I think would have been a good idea. They were actually planning to introduce Bass and eventually push Proto Man towards joining Dr. Light, which would have been a very interesting development. Unfortunately, by that point, Deke's constant trying to push things towards having more toy sales, which is why you kept seeing things like the stealth suit and so on, had successfully burnt off a little bit of the show's popularity, and by that point, Capcom chose not to renew the license. Fittingly, for a show made by Deke, the episode quality tended to fluctuate a lot. On one hand, you had episodes that ranged from good to simply spectacular. The pilot is generally considered the best episode, but Brobots, Mega X, and Future Shock are all considered pretty damn good too. On the other hand, you also have the worst episodes, not the least of which is the furry episode. If you've never seen Curse of the Lion Man, the episode in question, I'd almost recommend doing so if you haven't already. In every way, the episode is bad. The animation for that episode is terrible. The premise is awful. Curse of the Lion Man is so bad, in fact, that even the show's makers openly make fun of it. In one of the Archie comics of Megaman, there's actually a scene where Megaman is watching that episode in question, and at the end of it, he basically makes a joke along the lines of, "Man, I really need to start watching the quality control of my offshoots." It also makes fun of the Captain and Megaman, too, on top of this, which, okay, fair enough. Oh, dear God. Is it a bad sign that I spent most of the last few minutes talking about the Ruby Spears Megaman cartoon and not the soccer match in the slightest? I would make the absolute worst sports commentator, I swear to Christ. So do you think the Mega Man Soccer League has its own football hooligans? Because I think that would be a hilarious stretch. I remember some time ago I actually wanted to add a few Robot Masters to this game with mods, but it proved to be impossible just due to how the architecture worked. It wouldn't surprise me though if someday someone could take this concept and do something with it. I mean, have you ever played Mega Man 3D Deathmatch? No joke, it's a really well done Doom mod, and I actually would highly recommend checking it out. It's pretty cool. Man, Skullman is just paying for himself today. I wonder how the other Robot Masters react when they see this big giant team of Mega Man and then it just inexplicably has a Skullman in the front. Well, there are a couple of ways to get the ball downfield. I've generally found that which way works better depends on who you're feeling. Did Skullman just teleport? Did we not just pass with him, like, not even 4 seconds previous? I mean, I suppose I shouldn't really be surprised that the guy with the skull on his face is capable of slasher villain-style teleports, so you can see why I wanted this guy. You may have noticed I actually tried the passing play in order to get the ball in the net, but it just didn't work this time. Not that I'm not winning already, but a little bit of extra points never hurt anybody. Alright, so where was I before Skullman so rudely decided to teleport himself? Oh, right, plays. Generally speaking, there's 2 ways to get the ball downfield, and which one you should use usually depends on who you're using and who the opponents are. If you're facing a faster opponent, it's usually better off to pass very quickly. If you're facing a slower opponent, it's often better to use dribbling to get it down the field. The reason for this is the faster opponents are going to be really big on trying to take you out before you can even get the ball, so it usually makes sense to try to just keep it in the air. Slower ones are almost invariably capable of running you down with slides, but they usually can't keep up with you. So if you have a faster character and decent positioning, usually you can angle yourself ahead of them and keep going downfield while not really being able to be intercepted by them in the process, making it relatively safe until you get outnumbered. Like any tactic, however, this isn't really a hard and fast rule. There may be times where you have a faster opponent that's trying to run you down and you may be better off just trying to dribble it anyway. Or alternately, you may be facing a character who's taller and thus much more able to intercept, and you have to deal with that by not passing quite so much. A lot of this game is playing it by ear and correspondingly using your tactics accordingly. And there you get to see what I was talking about earlier, where because of Pharaoh's insanely high defense and tackling, he can easily just take the ball from you when he feels like it. His big weakness is that he can't keep up with faster opponents at all. Specifically, if you have any one fireman's speed or faster, he's not catching you. But he doesn't necessarily need to even be that speed to intercept your passes and screw with you. Pharaoh and Dustman are like the premier defensive characters in the game. And while Woodman falls into the same category, he's so slow that it's actually a little bit hard to use him. Which isn't to say he's bad. Woodman makes a fantastic goalie and actually can be quite useful in his own right. But you're going to see that when I have to fight him next, and frankly, considering the fact that Pharaoh really probably isn't able to earn 5-6 goals in the next 10 seconds, I think it's pretty safe to assume I've clinched that. I'm not entirely sure, but I'd assume it's a safe bet. With this particular match done, we have earned ourselves a Pharaoh and can move on to start facing Woodman in the next round. Thank you for tuning in, and I'll see you next episode.